Hello again, back to the land of nothing working right. You won't see the failed attempts I've made at making this video, but recognize it is my third attempt, so we'll see how this one goes. I'm gonna get straight to chapter 2, lecture. Okay, but that's the wrong way of doing it. Okay, so bear with me here. I'm going to share my screen and go ahead and share. Okay, perfect. We're going to describe inactivation and reuptake. Now, let's remember that inactivation and reuptake is what's going to happen. So we had an action potential shoot through this neuron. Calcium comes in when the charge gets to the end, spits out the neurotransmitter. This neuron over here is going to react to that neurotransmitter by taking it, probably opening ion channels, either ionotropically or metabotropically, and taking in some ions over there. And then the question is, what happens to the neurotransmitter? Because let's just go back and look at this. Here you got this neurotransmitter in green here, and it does not enter the neuron. Remember, it doesn't ever enter the neuron there. It's just kind of unlocking the situation for these ions, the red ones. Okay, so if it doesn't enter the neuron, what happens to this neurotransmitter is the concept. So what's going to happen here is of two things possibly, and it depends on the neurotransmitter. But after it's used to unlock an ion gate, it is either going to be inactivated, meaning taken out of commission. It's broken down by enzymes. So for example, with acetylcholine, which is a real common neurotransmitter, it's going to be broken down into choline and acetate. And there's an enzyme that does that. It's called the acetylcholine esterase. It comes in, it breaks it up, and then that gets carted away as waste, or it's used for other things. Okay, secondly, another possibility is reuptake. And reuptake is when this presynaptic neuron here is released the neurotransmitter, it gets used by the postsynaptic neuron, and then it kind of gets detached and it floats back out here, and this guy sucks it up again. It's kind of like a little vacuum cleaner, just takes it back, right? And what it does is it reuses it. And so serotonin, for example, is that way. Then you don't have to make neurotransmitters all the time, you just reuse them. And so we call that reuptake. It becomes important when we talk about certain drugs later on. And the vacuum cleaner there on the presynaptic neuron is called a transporter. And it's actually just sucks it right back up. Okay, so that's inactivation reuptake. We're going to talk about some neurotransmitters in terms of the synapses, drugs, and then we'll also talk about addiction a little bit. We're going to talk about some street drugs like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. Not so much a street drug anymore, but it used to be. Okay, first let's look at all the neurotransmitters. Now you don't really have to know all these, but just recognize you're going to see these names around quite a bit. Acetylcholine, as I said, a really common neurotransmitter. There's a group called the monoamines, and that is going to include almost all the ones that we're going to study here in psychology: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. GABA and glutamate are two really, really common neurotransmitters, GABA being inhibitory, glutamate being excitatory. And then you've got the peptides. You've probably heard of endorphins. You also have gases and purines, and you'll read some about gas called nitric oxide, which is a common neurotransmitter as well. Okay, well, there are two kinds of effects that drugs can have. So remember, drugs we take into our system, maybe we smoke some weed or something like that, it's going to go into our lungs, and from our lungs it's going to get into the blood. Remember, it's going to go through the blood-brain barrier, and so it's going to get to the brain. It can have two kinds of effects there. It can either be an antagonist or it can be an agonist. A drug is an antagonist if it blocks a neurotransmitter. So you have less of that neurotransmitter or less effect of that neurotransmitter. It's an agonist if it increases the effect of the neurotransmitter. So it effectively makes more of the neurotransmitter, makes the neurotransmitter more active. So antagonist is like anti, it's like anti-neurotransmitter. An agonist is like, yeah, make more, make more, make more. Okay, so this relates to addiction because addictive drugs, all of them are dopamine agonists. So every addictive drug has one thing in common: it increases dopamine. And increasing dopamine seems to lead to addiction. especially increasing dopamine in one place, the nucleus accumbens, which is an area of the brain that is deep in the forebrain, and it seems to be involved in addiction. Now, that area is also excited naturally during certain kinds of activities. So for example, during sex, that area becomes very active, lots of dopamine during sex. When you eat, you're going to get lots of dopamine there, gambling, video games, and stuff like that. So it's not surprising that some of these things are addictive in our culture, right? What happens with this area is it's not really about like liking something as much as it is about wanting it. And so it seems to be that when we really want something, that addictive feeling like I've got to have this is seems to be always associated with dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so let's take a look at some drugs. One is a stimulant, amphetamines and cocaine. Stimulants tend to be dopamine agonists, and therefore they tend to be very addictive. What happens is that what these drugs do is they reverse the transporter for dopamine. So remember that the transporter is involved in reuptake. The transporter will suck up that neurotransmitter again. If you reverse the transporter, then what you do is you push out more. You push out more, you push out more instead of sucking it up. And so what will eventually happen with the amphetamines is that because you're pushing out a lot of dopamine, this neuron doesn't have time to make more, and eventually you get a kind of a crash. And so people usually feel like SHIT once they, have had a lot of it, and they kind of crash. Now, what's interesting is that some of the drugs for ADHD have the same kind of effect, but the dosing is very different. So when you're taking it as an oral medication, it's being released little by little, and so you don't have, it still reverses the transporter, it still increases dopamine, but not as much. And so a little bit over time, you never get the crash. And they don't tend to be as addictive. So the more that you release dopamine, the more addictive it is. And these drugs are not terribly addictive, Ritalin and Adderall, although I'm sure you've seen some people that are kind of, into Adderall or whatever, at any rate. Nicotine, a very addictive drug, right? I have Nicorette gum in my mouth right now. I used to be a smoker, now just addicted to the gum. A little bit about me. Okay, so give me a cigarette. Cigarettes are very, very addictive. All kinds of tobacco is very addictive because of the nicotine. What nicotine does is it increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Again, it's a dopamine agonist. We can expect that because it's addictive. And it does so by stimulating acetylcholine receptors on cells that release dopamine. And so it releases dopamine, or does it a little bit less directly, but still very, very addictive and very potent at releasing the dopamine. Okay, well, one drug that doesn't release the dopamine, doesn't tend to be terribly addictive, is marijuana. Marijuana contains cannabinoids. Now, cannabinoids are a little bit different than most other drugs that clear from the system very quickly. So marijuana will tend to dissolve into the fat. And so what happens is if you smoke marijuana, you're going to have marijuana in your system for some time, or if you eat it or whatever you do to consume your marijuana, you're going to have it in your system because it gets stored in your fat, and it's going to do so for a week or more. And because of that, we don't get extreme withdrawal symptoms from marijuana. So if someone stops smoking marijuana, it's going to get out of their body so slowly that they don't feel that real crash from it. Okay, well, there are some endogenous cannabinoids, meaning chemicals that already exist in the brain that do the same kinds of things as marijuana. And those are anandamide and 2-AG. Those are released from postsynaptic cells. So here's a postsynaptic cell over here, remember? Normally we would see the release going this way, but this is a retrograde neurotransmitter. It goes the other direction. And what they do is they inhibit this cell. They inhibit the presynaptic cell from releasing GABA or glutamate. There's a lot of them throughout the brain, but there's none in the brainstem. Now that's important, because if it's not in the medulla and it's not in the pons, and it's not in that area of the brainstem, then it tends not to be lethal. because that's where breathing and heart rate and all that stuff exists. So you probably never heard of anyone ODing on marijuana, and that's why. People don't die from marijuana unless they just do something stupid like jump off of a building or whatever. Okay, so there are medical uses of marijuana. It's had a lot of success with neuropathic pain, muscle spasms. It's just become medically available in Missouri this year. It's starting to be, and it will be diagnosed for a range of problems, including migraine, headaches, and things like that. Okay. The hallucinogens. The hallucinogens are things like LSD, acid, and those are going to generally stimulate serotonin receptors. So serotonin receptor being stimulated means it's a serotonin agonist, right? Because it's spitting out more serotonin. If we have a lot of serotonin, that tends to create hallucinations, a lot more than we would normally have. Okay. MDMA is also hallucinogenic to a certain extent. This is also called Molly or ecstasy on the street. A very low dose will stimulate dopamine, but very high doses will really get serotonin going, and then we have hallucinations as a result. We have body temperature changes as a result, so people get very hot. They drink a lot of water when they're on this. And they get a sense of heightened activity and heightened enjoyment out of it. Repeat users show some pretty big problems, and that made us think, well, maybe there's some brain damage involved, you know, in some people who are using it a lot. And there's some indication in monkeys that we do see some brain damage to serotonin neurons, some death of serotonin neurons, and that would make sense that people then have problems with depression afterwards because they don't have as much serotonin. But it's really hard to tell because the same people that do a lot of ecstasy also do a lot of other drugs too, typically, so we can't tell what has actually caused the brain damage a lot of times. But anyway, that's a scary drug for that reason. Okay, so the opiates. The opiates are a class of drugs, including heroin, morphine, methadone. And they tend to stimulate the endorphin receptors, okay? And those are going to tend to inhibit GABA. Now, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it normally inhibits dopamine. So it's really an indirect path, but the ultimate thing is that dopamine goes up, and it goes up quite effectively with these drugs. So we do see a very high increase in dopamine, and with heroin, with morphine, and they tend to be very addictive because of that. That said, just like cocaine versus Adderall, it's the same effect as heroin versus methadone. Methadone is used medically. You take it orally, you get a much smaller dose, you get a much more steady dose over time. It tends not to increase dopamine as much. It tends not to be as addictive, although, you know, people keep up the addiction to methadone. And but you can function a little bit better on it, and it's used as a way of treating heroin addiction. Okay, finally, let's talk about alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant, and it does its work mainly through the neurotransmitter GABA. It also is going to block glutamate, and it increases dopamine, however, not as effectively as some of these other drugs. But mainly it's going to do its work through GABA, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it's not surprising that we get tired on alcohol. Now, of course, there is addiction to alcohol, and there's a couple of different types of alcoholics we can name, and it really has to do with the genetic tendency, whether or not you have alcoholism in your family. So the type 2, it tends to be the more genetic. And type 1 is when a person starts drinking relatively late. There's a gradual onset. They kind of work up and drink more over the years. Men and women both tend to have this. It's less genetic and less likely to run in families, and it's also less severe, less poor prognosis. So, you know, pretty good prognosis for these guys. They often stop drinking. Type 2 alcoholics are a totally different story. They start drinking when they're very young. They might start at age 16 or something like that. It goes woo, all of a sudden they're drinking a ton, and before they're 25 years old. These are mostly men. And again, it's more genetic, more runs in families, and it's more severe, much harder to treat than the type 1. So the genetics make a big difference. So let's talk a little bit about alcohol metabolism. There is ethyl alcohol is what we drink. That's the kind of alcohol that we drink. And what happens when we drink ethyl alcohol is that there's some enzymes in our liver that convert it into something called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is actually kind of poisonous to our bodies. It makes us sick. And so it's not surprising that if you drink a lot of alcohol, you probably get sick. And it probably results, it accounts for some of the hangover phenomena. Now, what happens to acetaldehyde, though, is that most people clear it out of the body using an enzyme called acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. And that will change it into acetic acid. Acetic acid is basically like vinegar. And so what happens is, and then that gets cleared from the body. So most of us drink, it turns into this kind of poison, but then our body kind of takes care of the poison. Now, some people do not have acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. Their body is ineffective at making this conversion. And so what happens is they get that acetaldehyde and they become very, very sick. And so some people literally cannot drink alcohol because of that. And you might have heard of that. People say, oh, I can't drink at all. I just have one drink and the face gets all flushed and all of a sudden they feel like they're going to die. Well, this is very common among Asian people. And I can tell you, I have both Japanese and Chinese people in my family. My father married a Japanese woman. My brother married a Chinese woman. My brother had 4 children with my nieces and nephews with a Chinese woman. My father had a child with a Japanese woman. And neither their wives nor their children can drink alcohol at all. And me, I can drink alcohol just fine. My father drinks alcohol like nobody's business. And, you know, I mean, all of us would be fine with alcohol, but that part of my family cannot. That has to do with being born without that dehydrogenase. And so it varies from culture to culture, but lots of Asian cultures have that problem. Well, now it doesn't mean not all Asian people can't drink. There are some Asian people who can drink quite a bit. But at any rate, it's more common. There's also a drug called antabuse, and that inhibits acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. So antabuse makes you into one of those people who's going to get really sick from alcohol. Well, it's great for stopping alcohol if you're really committed to it and you take it all the time. And then if you drink some alcohol, you're going to be puking your guts out. So it makes you not want to drink the alcohol. So that's a treatment for alcoholism. It doesn't work all that well because most of the time people just say, oh, I'm going to go get drunk. So I'll just skip my antabuse and then I'll go get drunk and feel fine. Okay. Who tends to get alcoholism? Here's the predictors. Men are far more likely to become alcoholic. People who do not get drunk as easily. So if you have to drink a lot to get drunk, versus if you drink one and you get real tipsy and everything, then you're unlikely to become an alcoholic. People who experience a lot of stress relief from drinking. There are also some physiological correlates in the brain. People with small amygdalas, and we'll talk about the amygdala. We already did talk about it. It's an area having to do, no, we didn't talk about it. It's an area having to do with emotion, especially in the right hemisphere. And people who are very impulsive or sensation-seeking types of people who take a lot of risks, those people are more likely to become alcoholic. All right, I hope that you guys enjoyed this lecture, and that is the conclusion of Chapter 2. Have a great day.